Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Today, we want to share you the editor stance on project methodology. We went through a lot of evolutions. We had a lot of product improvement. We had a lot of experience in small, medium-sized companies, and I would like to share that with you. I'll briefly design you the context, share some of the most important findings that we detected during the past years, going through thousands of small to medium-sized projects, some of the larger ones, some of the practices that we distilled out of it, and then, of course, at the end, I invite you to share your questions with me, please. So where do we start? Drivers. So we need to understand the components of our success. The reason why we're doing this is that we want to lead by example, share our experience. That does not mean that this is religious. The project methodology was fine-tuned in an iterative approach. That does not mean there is no space for other methods. There's no space for other ways of doing it. The product, you will see, allowed us to do certain things that were not possible previously. The methodology that I will describe to you, it also explains why we are in an accelerated growth, and that will continue to help us in accelerating that growth. You know all, we are in a market of resource constraints. I think all companies, let it be clients, let it be you partners, let it be potential clients, let it be us, we all struggle in finding the appropriate resources to staff the upcoming projects. And of course, last but not least, we have market expectations. Market expectations are changing. The lead times that customers underwent previously to obtain certain values throughout automation processes, those expectations are completely changing. Today, they're looking at an adoption rate that is much more higher than the ones that they were used to in the past. And that has direct implications in how we interact with the client, how we conceive added value throughout the project. One of the underlying elements of our success and of your success is simplicity. Simplicity is something that's extremely hard to get. And you have seen the product evolutions we went through, and you will see tomorrow morning the evolutions that we are expecting to go through in the coming year for V13. Simplicity allowed us to reconceive the way that we approach project methodology problems, and moreover the change management that is behind it, because everything boils down, once you have a product or applications that have sufficient maturity, you all know, for those that went through projects, and I think most of people amongst us, they have that experience, it all boils down to the human aspects, the degree of creating an acceptance level to allow for adoption whilst going through those automation processes. We admire greatly Steve Jobs, who was mastering the quest for simplicity, and I think the implications are all over the industry. So once again, the driving factor behind this methodology is the outstanding usability. Do not forget that this is our quest. As an editor, we always conceive and reconceive to fine-tune usability measures for the end user, whereas quite a lot of applications that are ERP-orientated are still focusing on management perspective and management perspective largely. So that usability that drives defining a different way in approaching. The competitive pricing. Today we can say that our value proposition is extremely strong. The business model that we changed when we went for V9 proves, and I think the number of people that are in the room, and as well as the success rate of the Odoo days today, they are a clear proof of that success rate, that this business model is really coming to maturity. And last but not least, the delivery model. Because of its component structure, family of applications, it allows us, on a commercial side, to use the front door or the back door. Quite often we see that we generate small momentum through adoption of a small application or a small portion of applications in medium to large companies, whereas we have not the possibility or we do not have the executive relationship to enter through the front door when we need executive sponsorship. And we know that that front door quite often is paved through RFIs and RFQs, and most of you also know the pain that is to go through those large investments, and sales uncertainty is fairly high. And of course, the delivery model is also composed of the strength that we are building up in the combination of partners and editors. So again, this is not a religion, this is a sharing of experience, and it shows the driving factors apart from the product, its proper success, is how we got here and where we want to continue to go. We want to be transparent about that. So that simplicity, which finds its roots in the product, is represented by the Odoo apps. That allowed us to look at certain practices, a specific approach for project management, and a specific drive for minimum viable product. And we are talking about minimal viable product in the sense of that we want to deliver a model, a solution, of a family of solutions that allows to do onboarding very rapidly. It's a main change management driver. People involving from the beginning in what the tools represent, making sure that they acquire the competence to use them, which is fairly easy, seeing the high degree of usability. And the third component is constituted by the behavior of our consultants, mainly the behavior of the project managers and the business analysts that we mobilize on our different projects. Sharing some of the findings, and indeed, are those findings surprises? I'm pretty confident that most of you recognize those components. We know that the Odoo value proposition today holds. It is fairly easy to be transparent and be clear about the value that can be offered on an executive level. Nevertheless, when you go upscale and you address Odoo application and related solutions to executive level, although that's quite easy, you can get executive buy-in, we know that the risk coverage takes precedence. What does that mean is the more complex the business, the bigger the business is. It can be, it's a public quoted company, which means that the executive in its proper role, his or her role, he wants to make sure that there is continuity. There is continuity for his or her proper position, also continuity for the different departments in his business model. So they are, in general, very risk averse. And third element is that data is paramount. One of the biggest risk factors in implementing the project is, time and again, data quality. One of the elements, I will discuss that later in this talk, is how to tackle that. Change management, making sure that the adoption can take place in a progressive rate. We also learned that although that executive intentions might be clear and that we possess the buy-in on an executive level, is that middle management wants to work on a status quo level. And the main advantage that we prone is the velocity. To make sure that change management takes place, we need to make sure that the hands-on and the proper use of the application takes place as early as possible in the process, which makes that those people in a phased approach, they become the advocates of the solution, instead of external parties or a top-down approach imposed by executive management. And another very, very risk-intense component in project methodology is everything that pertains to third party. Third party can constitute a risk when we talk about data. It happens quite often that we are not in a greenfield solution and that the legacy systems are maintained by external people. And to get data out of those legacy systems, the client himself or herself have to call upon those external sources, which means that you typically can have delays, it can be a lack of priority on the third party side, can be that technical information is not available. It can be that they don't even are able to get the data out of the existing system. Another element can be typically for interfaces, where the technical information is not available, or the technical information is not up to date. Again, availability of that third party, because they have their business to run in general. Generating information to interact with their systems is not always the priority. So in general, third parties, when they pop up in the project configuration, it raises a red flag for us, and it means that we really have to tackle that specific aspect of the project. So in a summary, if we compare our method of very fast onboarding to make the key user or the end user taking immediately part in the project, to incorporate them in the conception of the needs and the why behind the needs, instead of having a more conventional approach, you can see there is a significant difference on a focus level. On the conventional wise, they really want to make sure they cover their back. They want to make sure that all risks and all potential pitfalls are covered, whereas the focus on our implementation is make sure we have a fast adoption, and once they acquire the tool and they learn to use and to detect the full benefits of the tool and its logic behind it, then we can dive deeper into specific needs and eventually conceive a specific value. The advocacy, I already mentioned that. In a more classical approach, it's imposed. It's most often a top-down, where we want to have that as participative as possible. An element that we have seen time and again as well is that in a more conventional approach, that we try to copy behaviors. That's one of the main elements that drives change management or going against change management, is that most of the people, the departments, they know what they have. They can rule regarding their proper position, regarding their proper span of control. They know what they cover today. The unknown that scares. And that means that when you're confronting those people with new approaches, with new solutions, with the philosophy that is behind with Odoo, is that people, they typically start to emulate old behavior. They want to find their marbles back. They want to make sure that they remain in the known field. Whereas we really, through that method, and of course with the underlying help of the embedded knowledge and processes in the applications, we want to innovate. We want to encourage them to innovate. And that takes courage. And customizing, as again, the customizing is directly tied to the risk coverage, whereas we focus on customization only where it is clear that it's very high value to the end user. Let it be a manager or let it be a shop floor person. We are looking at larger companies since this year. Previously, I need to have the courage to say that it was very opportunistic. We have quite some logos as references, and those logos, we established a relationship most of the time because the executive leader in those large logo companies, they were pushing for them to work directly with us. It's not something that we had an active sales approach to conquer that market. So honesty obliges me to share that with you. As of this year, we are constituting a group that is developing a complementary focus on larger companies. Now you might say, why are you doing that? You're the editor. There are a number of reasons for that. First of all, the ecosystem needs references. We badly need references. We have more and more knocks on the door of people that are interested, all kinds of industries, all kinds of geography, and those people say, I'm really heavily interested in your philosophy, I'm interested in your business model, the products are attractive and very usable, but I don't want to be the first. And indeed, we are not immediately known for our verticalization. And you can smile if you want. So that behavior is fully understandable. So to make sure that we get and we continue the existing pool that we are living in the past 12 to 18 months, we need those references. And when I say we, it means the ecosystem. Does that mean that we are going to do massive sales activities to conquer large corporations? No, not at all. It is not our purpose to change our attitude and to shift away from our historic focus, which is on small and medium-sized companies. So we will probably do on an average 1 to 2 larger account type of implementations. So for the first reason I just gave, there's a second reason is we need that type of input. The complexity of those larger companies is somehow different. And again, it's fairly heavily tied to risk management. And we need to make sure, we need to learn from those experiences to make sure we can instill some of those complementary knowledge and processes into our tools. So that's a secondary axis along which we are working. The criteria that we maintain or apply for looking at that type of prospects is that we look at the ratio between the recurring revenue and the non-recurring revenue. When the gap is too big, typically we funnel that type of leads or that type of prospects to the network of the partners. Again, I repeat, we are not here to substitute partners. It is really to answer those two criteria that I mentioned before. A secondary axis is there sufficient participative change possible? That means, what is the mindset of that company? Because we will challenge them. We will not enter into a relationship when we feel that the prospect is pushing us into the full set integrator position. Since we are not interested, we want to make sure we create a relationship where the client uses on a long-term basis the licenses, and we are not there to make sure that we answer every exception that the business might generate for this particular large account. Building the momentum, as I just explained, the ecosystem needs that type of logos for the product to encounter even more success, for the partners to open a number of doors, which is facilitated by being able to mobilize that type of logos. And also a very important aspect is that they allow us to focus on the how. We will encourage them to pronounce themselves on what they need and why, what is the driving factor or the driving factors behind it. And we want to take the position that we can challenge that in a respectful way, in a sound way, but that we have the ability and we have the right with that particular deal that we can come up with creative approaches and we fill in the how. So a bit more detail about the mindset. So it is clear that client focuses on the what and the why. We focus on the success of the project, and that happens through the project manager and the Odoo business analyst. We want to focus on the success of the project, meaning the adoption of the standard Odoo solution as much as possible, and we question them respectfully again if the value is behind certain of their needs. That means using the simplicity embedded in the software to keeping things simple on a project level. So we want to move as fast as possible and come up with a prototype that covers as much as the business as possible. These ratios of 80%, grossly like that we can come up with that prototype and we can offer it to the client. And that is fully inscribed in the change management approach that we want to have that momentum from the end user and not only top management. What does that require? That means that we have a very high degree of autonomy on our business analyst or a project manager side. These are people, they have to fully master the application. They have to be fully able to configure to the fullest extent the application to make sure that we maximize the usage of the standard features and functions of the software. And of course, the downfall is that we want to avoid those custom developments. only when the value is fully pertinent. So that means we take quite a lot of responsibility compared to more classical project where we have a client taking a lot of space in the project management role, taking quite a lot of space in the version control, taking quite a lot of space in the definition of the specifications. So we continue along that axis. So the velocity that we're looking for is the main criteria that we use to recruit our people. So we do have rarely, if not to say almost never, developer people that evolve through career moves into the business analyst or the project management role. Typically these are people with a business context, with a business degree, that are activated as a business analyst and a project manager. So how does it look on a timeline? A typical timeline, and this subscribes itself into an iterative approach, is that we want to come up with a fairly short pre-sale cycle, expressed in weeks and not in months. Also to make sure that we keep the cost down. Again, I repeat, the business model of Odoo is fed by our license revenue, is not fed by our services revenue, which makes also clear why we have a fairly small marketing department, and that's why we want to keep those sales cycles so short. So then again, that we go into a needs and a proof of concept phase, which is typically roughly 2 months, 6 weeks to 2 months, where we assess properly the business needs. To come up in the 3rd month with a full-featured proof of concept, whereas afterwards, the more detailed work starts, as I said, on data importation and developments. And this cycle, I'm not going through the entire detail, is something that we iterate over and over again until the necessary scope is covered or until the full family of applications is implemented. Underneath, you can see the role of the different people, where you all see that the developers, they only come into place during the 3rd month and in the development phase and test and training, of course. One of the critical components is that we set a game plan. What does that mean? We have an interactive session prior to starting the activities with the client, which is what we call a project manifesto. And manifesto sounds perhaps a big word, but we want an engagement of the people that are mobilized in the project. So that means we typically translate that in a half a day to 1 day workshop, where we strongly invite for the executive or the stakeholders to be present. End users or key user representatives of the different departments or the different business streams, they do participate. And if indeed there are third parties that are critical to the success, they are invited to that project manifesto workshop as well. And what do we do there in a project manifesto workshop is that we identify the goal. And not the goal is I want to develop or I want to have access to this feature or this function. It's no, to well understand in which business context we are operating. Is it a client or a prospect that needs to fulfill his growth demands? Is that a client who has specific operational problems that disallow for his business to remain stable? Is he operating in a heavily changing environment, which means that he needs to have a certain flexibility? Is he in a cost-cutting approach? Does he need to increase productivity per headcount? And so on and so on. So it's very important to know in which type of context this entire project will be executed and how we will be looked upon when we are executing the project. How will we be expected to behave when we meet end users, when we meet suppliers, when we eventually meet some of their customers? I think a given for everybody is the roles and responsibilities. We need to make sure it is clear that everybody in the room knows who will cover what. There are no holes in that coverage, that we have no forgotten or gray zones in there. A very important element is data. I said data is everything. You might have the best system in the world, the best ERP system in the world. If you put crappy data in a good system, you all know the end result. So that's one of the elements that we try to establish upfront in the project, upfront in the timeline, is that we, in our case, Odoo, we really make it mandatory that the client is owner of the data, is responsible for data quality. What does that mean? Is I don't want my people not to spend hours and days and even weeks on data cleanup. Even legally, you might say, I do not have the right to do that. In certain countries, you can't. And for me, it is prohibitive. I cannot bring value to data cleanup for my customers. So I don't know the data, I don't know its origin, I don't know its longevity, I cannot say what is a duplicate or is not, I cannot say, is there a data quality management behind it or not? That's up to the client to do that. What we focus is when the data is presented at a given time in the project, our responsibility is to get it in our system, and preferably using standard Odoo tools. It happens, of course, that we're confronted with massive data volumes, and that it might be to make sure that we can meet the cutover process. The volumes require so much time to export it from the legacy system and then re-import it into Odoo that we might have to develop some scripts. So that takes place. But the rule of thumb is, for us, data is managed by the owner, which is not us. And the given as well is that opportunities and risks, we need to make sure that what can keep us back, what can hold us back in implementing this project. What are the opportunities? Is that we have the business context which calls for this family of applications to be mobilized, which calls for certain features and functions to be added because they contain high value. But are there other opportunities that come along with this? Are there optimization points that we can do? And that does not mean automation points. It can be that through the adoption of Odoo, that we trigger other opportunities, other windows to look differently at the business, to act differently, to change the processes, also the manual part of the processes, if the case might be. So this is a very, very critical phase. We do that interactively, and we do that online with the client. That means at the end of the day, we have filled in the template together with the client, and we go through it, and we get a sign-off at the end of the day. So before we split, we know that the project manifesto has been dealt with, and it has been dealt with in a participative way. That means the people that will be mobilized in the project, they almost put their signature underneath it. And whenever there is an issue related to project velocity, when there's an issue related to availability of key users or third party that needs to be mobilized at a given moment of time, then we can come up with the project manifesto to say, look, we all came to an agreement that if we want this animal to become mature, to have this project become successful, this is guidelines and these are decisions we all agreed upon. So this is like a buying method. At the same time, it's like a small tool that keeps us, it works as a safe holder. Entering into the business needs definition, we compile relevant business needs, and we have two ways of doing that. Either we work with Odoo applications as the baseline. That means, again, and that's why the PM and the business analyst needs to fully master on a functional level the different applications. We do demo sessions, and through those demo sessions, the client is able to challenge us, to challenge the PM, to challenge the business analyst to say, look, in my business, I have this and this constraint, I need to do it this way. Why? How come? Can you do it this way? We have a certain ability, a strong ability through the framework of Odoo to make quite a lot of configuration. We can do quite a lot. So we have what we call more the type of a gap analysis approach, where the client co-establishes together with the PM and the business analyst, where does my business stand? What is the value that I'm seeking compared to the value that the standard Odoo applications can offer? And then we compile that list, and then we can go over to estimate phases and to do budget. We have a parallel approach, which is more based on user stories. And the user stories is something most of you will know. It has a significant advantage that it establishes in a common language specific value that the user community is looking for. And this is completely tied to the dimension that we invite the client to focus on the what and the why. Those user stories, they really focus, they pull him a bit away of his daily operations, and they say, independent of my current way of working, independent of my legacy systems, all the tools that I use today, is what is the optimized value that I should be producing for my company, for whom I work? And being something that is expressed in a natural human language, it helps to share the value that is sought for. And it helps for that user community member to render explicit towards his other community members from other departments, from other groups, from a company within the group eventually, to make it explicit what he or she is looking for. And it makes it much easier to defend and also much easier to be constructively criticized. As I said before, is by going through that exercise, my colleagues, they focus on the why, and they focus on how to get a solution that is as standard as possible. And then the last step, as with the gap analysis, that all those needs that have been validated, they are challenged against the timelines, the priorities that are paramount for the company, which results into a definition of estimates and a budget. So the proof of concept, again, keyword, no development. Cover as much as possible. Try to generate as much of the features as possible. A hard aspect, but extremely important, is demo data. We are not in a phase, we are truly in a proof of concept, which means that together with the client, we have to come up with demo data. Knowing that the client is responsible for data, as I said previously, it is key success to the project that sound demo data is being generated. And sound demo data, that means that it represents, on average, all occurrences and all situations and variants that are needed to conduct a business. The second advantage that it has is it allows you to work in a confidence mode. That means that if, for any reason, we want to challenge the solution through another Odoo expert, which is not part of the project, or the client wanted to have it validated by a third party, which can be in the case of a re-engineering project, then we don't have to share confidential data. We do not consider integrating with whatsoever as a third party. And that proof of concept serves to demo to the end users, or the key users, depending how the setup of the project was. So how do we do that? How to generate that proof of concept? So within a limited time frame, using those native features and functions. So it's either driven by the user story approach, meaning value expression, or it's defined by gap expression, being features and function. Then we use Odoo Studio to do the rapid prototyping. Okay? If there is an advantage, a paramount advantage of Odoo Studio is that you can go so fast in presenting something that is viable to the key user. You keep momentum. I tie that to a previous element in my presentation, is you need to keep the momentum. When you start such a change process, you need to make sure that you continue to feed the change. If you have gaps in that process, then people disbelief starts quite often to appear. People want to see results. It does not mean that we are there to provide all over-encompassing answers to their needs. No, we present them through the proof of concept of what can be done very rapidly. They can do hands-on. They can say, okay, pull up the sleeves. We start to use a tool, and they can already make the match with their real-life operations. So for that Odoo Studio, we only use Odoo Studio for rapid prototyping. We do not use it to do long-term developments. Another element that is key to creating that POC is we have Odoo SH. And Odoo SH gives a huge advantage, is that it standardizes the entire version control and evolution process we have to go through when we apply the project methodology. It is a preset environment that allows you to decrease risk in variation, risk in human behavior, risk in when you have a compound of multiple developers, multiple business analysts, to make sure you have preset ways of converging later on in the project. There is an integrated runbot, which means, again, hands-on for the people who have to test it. Let it be a business analyst, let it be somebody that is a client that you want to mobilize in the functional testing. The runbot allows you to do granular testing and allows you to do integrated testing. And a fairly important aspect as well, and which is relatively new, is that the new Odoo SH environment also allows you to do profile testing. So we all know when it comes to risk management, quite often we are confronted with high demand, very high expectations when it comes to the granularity of security, of access rights, of rules, access to a given element of data, access to a given part of customer information. Today, with the new version of Odoo SH, you can do proper profile testing. So these tools are usually important to the success of the project. Coming to the more common phase is the data import, which is iterative, depending on the timeline and, of course, on the nature of the application that you are mobilizing. And there we heavily use the parking lot principle. Very, very familiar, very easy concept is that we distilled that entire mass of requirements. Let it be an outcome of the gap or let it be an outcome of user stories. Priorities were set. We know in an agile environment, priorities change quite often. Elements are detected that were not perceived or were not described during the gap or the user story phase. We have the principle of a parking lot. That means that we detect and we jot down those requirements. And it's together with the customer that we say, what is the substitution process? Do we stick to the initially affirmed priorities, or does one of those new elements takes precedence? And then a priority switch is done, knowing that the overall volume is constant. The parking lot principle is an area where we put all those requirements that are detected and that are low priority, but we keep an eye on them. And why do we do that? Because we learned that by that early adoption process, where the end user community is having very fast hands-on, is that quite a large amount of those initially important requirements, they are being dropped. Or they take another nature. They'll be fine-tuned, and priorities will change again. So by keeping that on the dashboard of the project and knowing that they're on a parking lot, we can also see how the adoption maturity level is evolving. Velocity, if it's possible, because of course the rhythm is for a big portion defined by our customers, is to have that velocity on a rhythm of a 1 to 2 week, and heavily on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis have those key users heavily involved. And of course in that phase we focus also on the third-party integrations. Another aspect that we put on the table more and more often is that there where the scope adoption is done gradually, we preferably start with a small user community which is more open to change so that they become advocates internally to the whole user community of the client. On the other hand, when it comes to access rights, we have an opposite funnel principle. We encourage there where the business model of the customer allows for it, of course. We prefer to start as open as possible and that we fine-tune the access rights throughout the respective phases. That creates less stress. It allows the people to detect additional features and functions of the applications, and it reduces the project risk related to typical access right problems. And again, here we are with data. There is always a check on data. Every time that we deliver something to the client, we request the client to check the data that comes with it. Remembering that we, in the beginning of the phases, we use demo data. Those demo data, if they're qualitatively okay, we need to make sure that every phase of the project, those data are mobilized and that the validations are taking place through the data, not only just the features and the functions. And then the validation and training, one of the main components that might be new to you is that we always invite the client for being responsible for this proper documentation. Why? Because the way the software is used is always dependent on the business context. The way it is described, the language that is used, the level of detail that needs to be covered is typically a phase that we don't cover, and we do not wish to cover. Stabilization periods for go live. It has to do with the dry run cycles. We have customers that are publicly quoted companies and they need X amount of dry run cycles for their accounting, which is mandatory. Sometimes multiple dry run cycles are needed to make sure you anchor the change that you want to instill in the user community. You can feel that the resistance is still there. It has been signaled by middle manager or through your delivery phases in your agile approach. It might be that you have to multiply the dry run cycles. Final data validation happens outside Odoo. Again, if data cleanups takes place, we do not do it in the tool. It has to happen up front. If not, we know it's not efficient to do it within the tool, and we know that the data cleanup fairly fast reaches its limitations. It is paramount again to the success that you validate that on a regular basis, that you get specific sign-off on the data, independent of the feature and the function that you're testing or that you're delivering. And the client interface, of course, needs to be validated separately with a third party typically involved end-to-end. We are a strong believer that we are an integral part of that fast-changing world out there. We want to be disruptive, and I think in the past couple of years we have proved that through our applications. The reason is there, the usability, the strong usability of our applications. It instills a new behavior on project methodology that I shared with you today, and we are convinced that it has to instill new behaviors from the people that are mobilized in the project. Let it be the PM, let it be the clients, let it be the suppliers critical to the success of the project. So we are confident that this business model as we operate it since version 9 is successful, and we want to share those success factors and the how-tos with you. So I welcome all questions that you might have to that subject, either today or later on through email or phone. Thank you. I don't know if there are people that wish to ask questions.
Johan, thank you for the presentation. Really nice and very useful. The question which comes up is how important is training and how do you deliver training? Is it on-site? What do you recommend? Because in bigger organizations, we always recommend train the trainer.
Yes.
But then trainer may not pass the same information over to the others. And then you go, okay, well, probably the training should be delivered by the partner or should be delivered by Odoo. How do you do it in your projects that we could learn from?
We largely recommend train the trainer principle. The profile of that person that will deliver the training ultimately to the end user community is really, really important. The reason we do it is that it is clear that if change is being brought by somebody that is close to you, you're more open to adopt that training. Typically, we do not encourage for it to be the team leader or the manager of the department, because hierarchy might, again, slow down the adoption level. So it should be a person that's really part of the end user community that is typically living professionally on the same level. The way we do that, it can be remotely or it can be done on site. Again, the cultural background and the language of the person is is as critical as the quality of the training. So that's why we always go over to the train the trainer principle. We have occasions, of course, that certain departments, they need to have the direct influence from an outside person, and then it happens that we get involved in that. But again, we typically try to avoid that.
I've got two questions, in fact. When you work with larger clients, the client will, one, return the question to you, and that is, how do you guarantee the data integrity?
Well, data integrity, as I said, is between the hands of the customer. What we do is we do not make an official assessment of data during our assessment, but whilst going through our assessment, we are confronted with data, and we're confronted with data inconsistencies. We share that during the project phases, because it can be that a given department works with his or her data properly, and another department is a little bit lazy, or they don't care. So that when we detect that, my colleagues, they bring that to the appropriate people, and typically that can be the stakeholders. What does that mean? It's not only detection, it is also to say, look, we will never be able to be successful when you as a client, you do not address the way you treat your data. Is there a method? And we're not talking about an automation method. We are not looking for immediately creating constraints in our system through development to make sure that, okay, you need to, what can I give for example, is that the surname needs to be in capitals and the first name needs to be in normal letters. So the purpose is not to instill requests to generate additional requirements to do data management principles within the Odoo application. No, we strongly encourage the client to say, look, we detected this. On a minimal level, you are strongly encouraged to establish a procedure or a process that has a regard to your master data, and that you develop an awareness on how that master data exists today and how it evolves. Customer data covered by multiple departments, who takes precedence? Is there a data owner? And we try to funnel those ideas to the respective people, because master data is large. The product data definition, does that belong to the sales department or does it belong to another department? It depends on your client, but we through the assessment, we in general detect those things and we make the recommendations. And when there's a data management process that is fully absent, we can say, we can't continue without you having addressed that aspect. So it can become a really critical point on moving forward or not.
Yeah, but it's typical. You get the answer, well, our data is there, and it's like it is. But you have a system which loads our data and is handling our data. You need to define and guarantee that the data integrity entered into the system keeps its integrity. All those processes within large companies are all defined. Ownership is also defined. But you will always get the question back, how do you guarantee the integrity of the data?
Well,
Because those larger companies are working with GXP compliances, all those FDA regulated compliances, and you get those questions back. Also, when you look, to give an example, the Odoo.sh, it's a great tool, whatever you want, but there is a lack of transparency behind it. A lot of the larger firms will not be able to use the Odoo.sh because there is no control mechanism behind, or a logging. In fact, you can define it as in one word, and that's a lack of transparency.
It depends.
It's
Two answers.
It's all open source.
Yeah,
Great.
it's also open source, and that's a natural consequence of the business model that we are all here vehicling.
Yeah. And that's great. That has always been great. But as soon as you start to combine different parts of open source, you need to define how you did it and prove that it was successful. That's also the main reason why all those compliancy rules exist today.
You're right. I have two answers. I want to answer your previous question, is that how do you do that to instill data quality? It always starts with identifying the data owner. If there is data problem, the main root cause is that there is absence of who's the owner of the data? Who is responsible if I try to reach out to a client and my data are wrong? So this the first step is always to say, you have your master data, you have the different elements to your master data. Which individual, and we're not talking about the department, which individual is responsible for data pertaining to inventory? Who is responsible for product data, product definition data? When a new customer is created, who does that? Who takes precedence over somebody else? What are the typical conflicts? And by bringing that forward, when we do data imports, we quite immediately see that our data problems. So we do upfront dry runs of that. We take a subset of data delivered by the client, we do the imports, and quite often it becomes very blatantly. So the proof is something that is easy to offer. The first step, as I said, is you make sure the client sticks a name to the master data components. Okay, that's the first step of the change management process that has to take place, which you can say it's independent of Odoo, it's independent of it is not. Because I said again, you can have a lot of effort and a lot of money spent in that implementation. At the end of the road, because of your bad data, bad quality of data, the people will not believe in the system. They make the system responsible for the data being bad. So there's something, and that's why it figures in the project manifesto. It has to be agreed upon, it's customer responsibility. You start with identifying the owners of the respective master data, and in the second phase you say, what is the process? How do you treat today? Where are the conflicts? Where are the bottlenecks? And you have to invite the client to make that investigation, because you have the ultimate proof is when you do the dry run on data import, it becomes blatant again. So you can tell the customer that he didn't do his job right so far, and you can make recommendations. But I strongly recommend You have the responsibility to say this is a huge risk factor. We have lived through it. But you cannot take ownership of all the risk factors that are identified or that exist into a customer environment. You have the responsibility to say, look, I detect them. And if I don't detect them, but I can tell you, it's not because I have not detected them so far in my project that they are not present. So you have, I think, a moral obligation to safeguard the success of the project, that you say, look, you have to look at that. You have to investigate, because sooner or later it will become paramount. I hope that answers the first part of your question, and we can discuss in detail afterwards, with pleasure. The second part of your question is about Odoo SH. It's version control and structured version control. So you can make visible at any time, you can look at your code hierarchy, is which version of code has been pushed, which code has been integrated or connected with other code. So you have that traceability. We are fully integrated with GitHub, which makes it, you have the advantage that you have the entire ecosystem of GitHub, which is like almost an auditing mechanism. You can always prove the origin of who's the author, what were the changes were made, and what time they were done.
That is all nice about Odoo SH. But don't forget, Odoo SH is also software on itself. And you have different versions of Odoo SH. Odoo SH doesn't stay still.
It is.
As well.
That's correct.
And you as in fact, let's say, fabricating software, you have to show how these versions came apart. And you need to prove that as well by means of logging or
Excuse me.
Okay, I misunderstood your point. Yeah.
guarantee those large versions.
Yes, you will. Yeah, we'll have another talk coming on, but I will be more than glad to accompany you, and we can talk further through to those two elements with pleasure. Thank you.
My question is, do you offer some kind of templates for key documents for project implementation, or do I need to use my own? Because it would be helpful, you explained the methodology, it's very good, but to document it properly in the project, do you offer some templates?
We can do that. We can do that. We didn't make any templates public so far, but that is something that we can formalize and we can share with you, indeed. As I said, we want to lead by example, and again, for this type of project philosophy, I greatly encourage to learn from the mistakes that we made. So yes, the answer is yes.
Hi. Do you have any recommendation for localization development? How deep do we have to go in localization for no mess with Odoo in general?
But localization, first of all, I'm not a localization expert, and I will be glad to direct it to our localization team. Localization is all driven by what is reasonably accepted in a given area or a given country. We talk about laws, we talk about practices, commonly accepted practices. So when we start about, if you open the debate about localization, where to start, but typically you start with what is legally required to operate a business practice in the area or in the country that you wish to address the localization. That is what we call the minimum viable product for your localization. And that is something that we encourage you to do, and it's something behind which we stand. When it comes to current practices, that means these are customer expectations in a given industry. That is something that we do not feel is pertaining to a localization. Because it's not because best practices in a certain industry exist. As long as they are not legally binding, we do not consider them as being part of a standard localization. That does not mean that you as a partner, you cannot or will not address them, but that's up to you to decide how far you want to go. Does that fit in the business model that you want to prone as a partner? Okay?
Hello, thank you very much, first of all, for the presentation. If I am not wrong, you mentioned about using Odoo Studio as a prototyping tool, but not use Odoo Studio for long-term development. What do you mean about this distinction, prototyping and long-term development? Can you open it further?
As I said, the key component to project implementation is velocity. We want to have end users start using the tool as fast as possible because it drives costs down afterwards. And therefore, there is an Odoo Studio in the version it exists now, and even more as our CTO presented. Even more, it shows its full strengths in prototyping. That does not mean it's an exclusive use for prototyping. Yeah? I'm just saying that in my context, where I have project methodology responsibilities and where I have to drive the success of the projects, I push my people to use that foremost as a prototyping tool. As you saw yesterday, the new version contains the ability to very rapidly generate reports. The knife cuts on both sides. You can very rapidly come up with a report. It takes sometimes minutes instead of half a day, or sometimes there are reports, as you, with calculated fields and everything. Sometimes it can take even more time. Your strength foremost resides in the prototyping capabilities of Odoo Studio. So that is your main strength. You can generate something at a very low cost and you can confront the customer and say, look, this is what I understand, this is what I heard, is this what you're looking for? That's a massive strength. Okay? That does not withhold you that if you get buy-in for the client for something that you generated through your prototype, to not withhold it in your productivity system, in your production system afterwards. But that's a call that you make. But I'm talking from a project methodology system where I foremost use it in its prototyping capability. We have now an involvement in Odoo Studio quality where we can generate properly the modules, so its strength is being bumped up also to make sure you can use it afterwards in a productivity mode.
So are you using at the moment Odoo Studio in your production systems rather than development?
No, in my area in my span of control, I largely use it for prototyping usage.
Is there any reason behind it about technical capability or?
Excuse me, I didn't get that.
Any real reasons why you are not using Odoo Studio in your production system?
Well, any given reason, no. It depends on the degree of complexity, it depends on the size of the developments, which again, I recall as the purpose of this talk is to say that philosophy behind it is to develop as least as possible, is that we consider the need, and we have a validation point on a system architectural level, which goes sometimes beyond Odoo Studio. But again, it's a recommendation I do because the ultimate strength resides in there. That does not mean please do become religious in there. The tool is getting mature enough to use it as something that generates codes on a production level. But that call from a qualitative perspective is something that you as a partner, as an implementer, you have to make. And that's a case by case.
Thanks. I've got a question. User acceptance testing. Where does UAT fit into your methodology? And second question is the test scripts for user acceptance testing the client's responsibility or the implementation partner?
But testing, first of all, user acceptance testing we perhaps do not stick to the specific conventional definition of user testing. Is that, first of all, we seek approval for the proof of concept. That is the imperative task. So you can say, is this user acceptance testing? Perhaps in the conventional way it is not, but it's part of the family of user acceptance testings for us. Let it be for individual features or functions of the standard, or it can be throughout the processing end to end that we seek validation. So yes, it starts very early in the process as of the submission of the proof of concept and the way that we challenge ourselves by presenting a proof of concept to the client. So it's throughout. It starts already in the proof of concept phase. When it comes to the scripts, it depends. There is no one conclusive answer that say absolutely it's white or black. It depends. It depends on the complexity. It depends also on the potential impact of a given feature or function that has been generated containing high value. Typically, high value means also high impact when you fail on it. So there, quite often, yeah, we generate the test scripts. Knowing that with the existence of the runbot, every time that we spawn a new feature, it is submitted and made available on a runbot, individual runbot level to the given user community. So we have an inherent mechanism through the runbot to facilitate the testing itself. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't work. Yes, I can hear you now.
It's okay? I can talk.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's quite interesting and useful. I'm myself a project manager, so I find it very useful. My question is, yeah, a bit more in the direction of the templates and also in the direction back to the business. Is there an idea for Odoo to develop in the future some app that it's covering project methodology? So this project methodology, for example?
But when we do implementations, surprise, we use our proper software. It would be bad if I would be here saying as an editor, we don't. And it's not because of that, of it's just there. No, it's an efficient tool. It is perhaps not conventional in the way it is presented, like our customers are used to see with certain other competitive products. But we actively use our project application. We define the phases. Dynamically, we define the phases in Odoo project. We share access to the given Kanban cards, which means every Kanban card represents a given deliverable. That means when the Kanban card evolves, but the client or the community that is interested and tied to that given feature, but they see its evolution, they can see if they disapprove, but it is reflected in the Odoo project app. So we use Odoo project in all its capabilities very actively in the way that we translate the project methodology reality. So and we can talk afterwards. We can talk further if you say that does not suffice, and eventually we can talk to R&D about it. But all my people actively use Odoo project for that. I think it's coming to an end. Perhaps a last question, if that's okay. No? I will take your question offline then. Thank you so much. Have a good day further.